I'm Agent Morris with the NSA.
There is something real here.
Do you believe that our government is in possession of UAPs?
Absolutely, based on interviewing over 40 witnesses over 4 years.
And where?
I know the exact locations, and those locations were provided to the Inspector General and some of which to the intelligence committees. I actually had the people with the first-hand knowledge provide a protected disclosure to the Inspector General. Biologics came with some of these recoveries. Yeah.
Those could represent exquisite new adversary technology.
Non-human, and that was the assessment of people with direct knowledge on the program I talked to that are currently still in the program.
The government is covering up some level of its knowledge and understanding about what some of those things are.
The Sol Foundation, which just announced a new initiative for UFO research and policy.
It's nuts, man. I mean, we're just small-town buds who saw a UFO in the woods. I mean, now we're hanging out with the government.
Wow. What floor were you guys on?
This is Miles Lewis, and you are tuned in to another live edition of Anomaly-NOW, straight out of Austin, Texas. This is the Weekly News RoundUp show, live for the 501c3 Scientific Anomaly Institute Anomaly Archives. We are dedicated to preservation and public education as a community effort, as a charity, 501c3, as I already said. Well, welcome. This is another live edition for this April 10th, 2024. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, the founder of this nonprofit, and great to be with you. So last week I touched on, as we return to the airwaves, the recent AARO report, long awaited, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, whatever the heck they call themselves, the latest government attempt to quell people's obsession with what is that up in the sky, and are we alone, and that sort of subject. And last week I mentioned that, yes, the AARO report is out. It's not huge. It's fairly digestible, but I had not at that time had the chance to read it, and finally took the time, read through it, and goodness gracious, as I said last week, I feel about 50-50 on the issue of the quality of this report. I think it makes some good arguments. It's a good historical overview to a point, but you really want your government reports to be accurate, to make it seem like they actually know what they're talking about. And that does not seem to be the case with this. I had previously mentioned that it was critical of and described a kind of echo chamber effect for those activists, those UFO friendly people who have over the years been proponents for disclosure or for trying to suss out what exactly the government knows in terms of government programs. Are there any reverse engineering programs, that sort of thing? And obviously there's been a lot of criticism of this report, and it is certainly well-deserved. Having finally read it, I really felt like, okay, it does touch on a lot of the different organizations, the different research projects that have happened with the government, but it's focusing on the government and the military. It's focusing on the tech end of this. It's focusing on the what's it angle, the things that sensors can detect versus, the things that are really more at the forefront of people's interest in this thing. The subjects like, what about the occupants? I don't know that it mentions occupants at all, ever in the report. In fact, I could probably search for that right now. Occupants, no, 0 hits. It does, however, briefly, under the section Commonalities of 20th and 21st Century UAP Investigations and the subheading International Security, Environment, and Technological Surprise, it mentions psychological warfare operations. Good on them for bringing that up. It's quoted as saying, one primary means of competing with the Soviet Union was to collect intelligence on Soviet leadership intentions and military capabilities. The means by which the U.S. accomplished this goal was to develop a range of air and space-based reconnaissance systems to collect an array of intelligence on the Soviet Union, especially over its territory. During some early UFO investigation efforts, it was deemed essential to determine if UFOs were Soviet secret weapons or psychological warfare operations aimed at causing public fear and generating hysteria to undermine U.S. societal morale. The same thing that our government's been accused of as part of its disinformation, misinformation campaigns. There is so much evidence for the fact that whatever the true nature of the UFO phenomenon, people's beliefs in it have been manipulated by governments, by corporations, by advertisers. Obviously, they've got a stake in making money off of people's beliefs and fears. But more often than not, I strongly suspect, and the people I respect suggest that, again, whatever the true nature of the UFO phenomena, there are elements within the government and the military industrial intelligence complex that are using people's interests and obsession and beliefs about these phenomena, about extraterrestrials particularly, to manipulate them for their own ends, often for sussing out espionage, counterintelligence, counterterrorism type information. Does this report go into that? Of course not. They were tasked with looking for whether or not reverse engineering programs exist. So there's a lot of information in this report, but as I think we have pulled up there, this review of the report by Barry Greenwood, who is one of the board members of the EFR Expanding Frontiers Research, headed by Erica Lukes, Jack Brewer, and other board members like Barry Greenwood. Barry Greenwood is one of these longtime UFO activists, but in the best sense of the researcher, being a skeptical, journalistic approacher to these subjects, a seeker of information, uncertain perhaps what the true nature of what they're looking into is, but recognizing that one needs to be very skeptical and rational and fact-based. Now, Barry Greenwood also is in with all the folks working with David Marler in New Mexico with his organization, which has joined forces with CUFOS. And what we have pulled up is Barry Greenwood's review of the recent AARO report. And yeah, Barry Greenwood's the kind of guy that I would expect to be able to cite chapter verse as to where they got things wrong. And he goes through point by point. So we'll be posting the link to the CUFOS.org link there in the show notes. Does a great job of bringing to focus all these interesting issues related to how accurate this AARO report is. And that doesn't make folks like us very comfortable in terms of the analysis of this organization. They get several important facts incorrectly, and just some of the things that Mr. Greenwood goes over include the errors. He also rightly focuses on the fact that, and this is something I alluded to in the previous show, that the Skinwalker Ranch aspect of this, so much of what was part of the real OSAP, ATIP, OSAP being the actual name, ATIP being the nickname for that program, was directed at research, paranormal research, poltergeist research, haunting research, and UFO research, but mainly just weird phenomena research at the famous, infamous Utah Ranch, which so many people are rightly critical of. And they never, of course, in this report name, they never mention Skinwalker Ranch. That would be a bridge too far, I suppose. I think they simply refer to it as the Utah Ranch or the property in Utah, page 23. Greenwood writes, the report mentions that an earlier rendition of AARO, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, OSAP, investigated a quote-unquote property in Utah, page 23. This is, of course, Skinwalker Ranch, which, for reasons that are unclear, is unnamed. I think it is fairly clear that the reason is that they don't want to call out the fact that there's this component of this that was so focused on the paranormal. Because, of course, I'm pretty sure Barry Greenwood, while he may have a passing interest in the paranormal and UFOs and or his ghosts and hauntings, UFOs are his bread and butter and his main area of focus. But he rightly debunks or points out the right reason to be skeptical about the whole claim that U2 sightings were somehow bulk of the Blue Book cases. In the subsection of his review called U2's Did It, he says, quote, quoting the report, quote, more than half of the UFO reports investigated in the 1950s and 60s were assessed by U.S. reconnaissance flights. Page 41 says the AARO report, alluding to a 1997 CIA article by Gerald K. Haynes, CIA's role in the study of UFOs, 1947 to 1990, from the publication Studies in Intelligence, again published in 1997. Under its recounting of the Eisenhower era's Project Aquatone, they say that UFO reports would spike when U-2 spy planes were active, except beyond the simple declaration that spy planes were responsible for so many reports, there is no evidence whatsoever that this was the case. Haynes drew from a formerly classified book, Gregory W. Pedlow and Donald E. Welzenbach's The CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Overhead Reconnaissance, the U-2 and Oxcart programs, 1954 to 1974, published in 1972, which, when it was declassified, was found to have the same comment without evidential support. That support should have come in the form of detailed reports showing that a majority of Project Blue Book cases from the initiation of spycrafts were due to those flights. Does the record show this? Did the CIA keep a separate collection of its investigations into the majority of cases in its own files? Does Project Blue Book show that even a majority of their conclusions were aircraft? Unquote. Is there a hint in any of the existing UFO records that secret CIA investigations of Project Blue Book cases occurred? His point being, well, they're just declaring this based on this one source. And this goes back to something I've said repeatedly, which is, well, it's a rational argument of secret programs as cover for or misidentifications of that are the bulk of UFO reports. It seems highly unlikely, and if you can't actually provide the data to prove this, then why should we trust you? As it ends this section with, despite this, the Haynes article is cited 17 times in the AARO report. Is this the rigorous analytic and scientific approach the AARO is touting? Seemingly not. But there's a lot of other issues here with sourcing and the different details that, again, hardcore UFO researchers know is wrong. And some of the other links that we'll be providing, I had mentioned previously Massimo Teodorani's article on his website criticizing the report. His is more from an angle that we'll get to in a second, but of course, good research and reportage by Micah Hanks over at The Debrief, and in his weekly podcast, The Micah Hanks Show, has very well illustrated that this is a very bad report. And as much as some of us want to give the government the benefit of the doubt, why they deserve it, that's a matter for debate. But, you know, we kind of would like to see some effort on the part of these researchers in the government to do their jobs and do it well. It would be nice. Then it might actually give us pause to think, oh, they actually are doing their due diligence. And when they say, we found no crash saucers and pickled aliens, we might actually believe them. Some of the other issues that I have with this, really, it gets to Massimo's argument, which is more from the angle of, what about all the academic, peer-reviewed scientific research efforts that have been done to the UFO subject, whether it be on the sightings themselves of these mystery objects or the apparent contacts, interactions with occupants? Again, occupants are not a part of the AARO report. And maybe that'll come up in volume 2. We can hope, right? Maybe, as Micah Hanks and others have said, maybe they'll correct the record and correct their errors from this volume 1 report. But again, not holding my breath. But Massimo and others rightfully criticize this report for failing to address really the thing that really drives human interest in the UFO phenomena, which is this idea of contact, the idea of, are we experiencing some other non-human intelligence? Maybe it is, as Massimo and others sometimes suggest, that it could just be some kind of natural occurring phenomena that gives us the distinct impression that we're interacting with an intelligence. And I'm still open to that. However, I tend to lean towards the idea that there is, in fact, some kind of alien intelligence here. And this lack of the AAROs and so many other approaches dealing with the human element is another important part of where we need to go. Oh, one last thing. In the comments to Barry Greenwood's critique of the report. He was going on in his review about what is it about this whole 1945 date that's in the AARO report and the legislation that enabled it to mandate its reportage. And of course, I think he knows the answer to this, but some folks in the comments were commenting that Ron James, director of MUFON Media Relations, asserted on the Paracast on April 30th, 2023, that it was specifically he, along with MUFON and their lobbying firm A10, look into A10 and MUFON. Very interesting, some might say creepy association there. Their lobbying firm A10, who were responsible for having the 2023 NDAA clause requiring the military to provide all info on UAP beginning at 1945 instead of 1947. Of course, most people, as Greenwood asserts, most ufologists, most people who've tracked the UFO phenomena would put the beginning of the modern era of UFOs as 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sightings, the Maury Island incident, and the then wave of quote-unquote flying saucer sightings that resulted. Of course, there are things that preceded it, like the ghost rockets and the Foo Fighters, all of which were investigated by our military and intelligence establishment, but do seem to be like the previous era coming to an end before the unfoldment of this new era. Of course, and I think it was a commenter, Steve Long, who made that comment about Ron James and MUFON claiming that it was they who got that, which is interesting because MUFON, of course, was one of the first mainstream UFO proponents of the Trinity case, the case that has become so controversial that Jacques Vallée and Paulo Harris have promoted despite a lot of information indicating that it's a hoax or that it is not all it's claimed to be. And it goes back to 1945 and the Trinity bomb test predating the 1947 incident. Now, I'll see if I can share this briefly here, but there is at the New York Times last year in January of 2023, an article, Did Aliens Land on Earth in 1945? ? A defense bill seeks answers. And there in the article is Jacques Vallée, a longtime ufologist, astronomer, and computer scientist, said the amendment's inclusion in the defense bill was, quote, an absolute turning point. This is what all scientists and my colleagues have always dreamed of, said Dr. Vallée, who has helped study reports of UFOs for the Centre National d'Études Spéciales, the French space agency. He said that the U.S. government's agreement to dig into the past meant, quote, the stigma has been removed. Vallée has been studying the Trinity incident several years ago alongside yada, yada, yada. Now, obviously, there's a lot of controversy surrounding that case, a lot of concern for Vallée and his reputation based on his supporting it. I'm not going to get into any of that, but it's interesting that they did push that date back. Honestly, I don't know why one could complain about that because it might still uncover other information that might be relevant. Has it so far? It has revealed in this report? No. But then again, as we've indicated, the report is riddled with errors, fundamental factual errors of timelines and so forth. But maybe they'll rectify that. But it brings me back to Jacques Vallée and the Saul Foundation, another interesting, important organization that has sprung up and which featured Jacques and many other interesting characters in the UFO scene who spoke last year, or was it early this year? I forget. Anyway, and if you'll recall my past coverage of this, I was not able to be there, but some of our good friends, Micah Hanks and Greg Bishop and others were there, and several of them commented on the fact, and other attendees as well, that Vallée, in the face of all this new classic militaristic, objectivist, materialistic, this issue of like the objects and the sightings, sans contact, sans occupant, sans close encounters, his mentor and friend J. Allen Hynek, having come up with the classic close encounters scale of first, second, third close encounters, he rebuked them in a sense at this conference saying, what about all that? That's the most interesting and important part. And where he says in his speech that you can watch on YouTube at the Saul Foundation's YouTube channel, he asserts, this is where he's going. He's going full tilt into the high strangeness because he believes, like so many others among us, that that's where the gold lies. Is he right? Is he wrong? I can, again, see both sides of the argument. I lean, obviously, towards him being right. but then I would. Now, there's some big news on this front of, well, what about the occupants? What about the encounters? What about the contact aspect of these phenomena, these experiences? And that's where the new revelation of a project happening at Rice University comes into play. Victor, if you can bring up that Rice article. So this was just published yesterday. Thankfully, David Metcalf promoted it, as did our good friend Greg Bishop. A Decade of Discovery, 10 Years of Rice's Archives of the Impossible. And I'm just going to read a bit from this. Now, some of this is very much kind of like the PR aspect of reports that Jeff Kripal and others have been putting out there, but I think this is a very big deal from the article. It all started with a conversation during a ride to the airport in December 2014. Jeffrey Kripal, Rice University's professor of religion, was wrapping up a trip to Berkeley, California, where he'd spent time with Jacques Vallée. Jeff says, he asked me if I could help him place his files and correspondence in a university archive of some kind. I immediately thought, I wonder if Rice can do this. Kripal, who released Authors of the Impossible in 2010, worked with Rice's Special Collections Director to create and host the Archives of the Impossible, a collection of accounts detailing the supernatural. The basic idea is that these are things that aren't supposed to happen but do. Human beings are experiencing these impossible things, and they've been reporting them for as far back in history as we can see. He goes on to explain how Rice's connections historically to NASA make this a perfect place for these items to be reposited. Inspired by this successful collaboration, Kripal extended a similar invitation to Whitley Strieber. And then they also got the works of physicist Ed May, of course, famous for his work on the Stargate remote viewing program. Now, approaching 10 years since that airport drop-off, the archives consist of 15 separate collections, one of the most recent coming from John E. Mack, a Harvard medical psychiatrist who investigated roughly 100 cases of alien abduction, conducting hundreds of hours of interviews. His gift to the archives consisted of 150 boxes, which translates into 450 linear feet of records and files. Quote, every collection we accept represents hundreds of hours for archivists, along with delivery and storage. That's why he works so closely with Amanda Folk, Rice's head of special collections at the Woodson Research Center. We do a lot of collecting of archival materials that support faculty interest. Folk said, adding that Rice undergraduate and graduate students have helped process the archive's gifts from day one. Quote, archives contain many thousands of documents in the form of books, journals, photographs, slides, etc. Well, they go on to mention, after working with WRC and Kripal for several years to transfer and digitize the Mac donation, Karen Austin officially joined Rice as the project manager of the archives in April of 2024. So this is brand new news, according to this article, that she has joined this effort. And in fact, you can go to YouTube. We'll provide the link in the show notes. But one of the other videos that's available is of, here we have Jeff Kripal introducing the woman in question, Karen Austin, who delivers a very emotional presentation at this conference that was posted 9 months ago, and involves her describing the effort to digitize these materials from the Mac collection, get them over to Rice. And now she is going to work directly with Rice to do this study, which involves so much more. So Austin, going back to the article from Rice, Austin worked with Mac in his research, eventually becoming his personal assistant. After his accidental death in 2004, she played a pivotal role in assisting his family with the closing of his estate, which involved managing various projects related to the administration of his personal affairs. Archives of the Impossible is presently undertaking a 2-year metadata research study in collaboration with the John Mack Institute. Austin said, quote, we will anonymize and analyze various archival collections related to alien abduction, a phenomena that peaked in the latter decades of the 20th century. The study will be the first of its kind in terms of methodology, scope, and scale. You can read the rest of this over at news.rice.edu. We'll again post a link. But I think this is massive. And as I've been saying for the last several years, since the 2017 New York Times articles by Blumenthal, Kane, and others, there is a sea change happening. And while I am very skeptical and paranoid, one might say, of the militaristic aspects of this, and there's always been this meshing of these UFO researchers, Jacques Vallée included, working hand in glove with these military intelligence characters. And yeah, you can, I would encourage everyone to be skeptical and concerned about some of this. But I do honestly feel that the other sea change that's been happening in the academic world is of equal, in fact, greater significance and importance to the actual helpful study of this mystery. And I'm really excited by this. And while, as some critics and skeptics I know and have seen post online have already said, well, what are they going to find other than a bunch of fairy tales? Well, there is a mythic component to this phenomenon. There is an aspect of all of human experience coloring our experiencing of the anomalous, the mysterious, the unknown, the alien. It couldn't be any other way. And just because the dream world that we all experience every night can be influenced by those same factors, those same fears, those same desires, doesn't invalidate the importance of examining those dreams, those contacts, those encounters. And I look forward to what I think some of the best minds might find when they approach this. Now, to just throw it back the other way for skepticism's sake, one last thing. Victor, you can pull up the Ray Stanford article. I have not read this yet, but the same person, Douglas Dean Johnson, who wrote an extremely skeptical but seemingly rational, if not vitriolic and vindictive perhaps, but a very good expose on the Trinity case and his evidence that it's a hoax, has, of course, long had a thing for Ray Stanford. In fact, if I remember correctly, Douglas Dean Johnson actually was involved with Mr. Stanford here in Austin at his PSI, Project Starlight International organization, back in the day. So is there a little bit of a vendetta there? It seems like it. But like I said, I haven't read this yet. I'm sure I'll find it very similar to the criticisms of the Trinity case and Vallée. And he's already been posting about this for years. And I find it helpful, but I also find so much of it just a little too much in terms of what I'm interested in terms of the UFO phenomenon. I think it is important for us to have skeptics, honest skeptics in this community. And I have plenty of skeptical and debunking friends who are interested in these subjects. What gets me is when I'm like, well, so do you think that there's anything to the true UFO phenomenon? Do you think that there is a there? Is there some kind of non-human consciousness at play? And if they're like, I don't care, well, so be it. That may not be their bailiwick, and maybe they're all just out to make a name for themselves or to do their part in trying to, say, minimize the impacts of mass belief in crappy third phase of the moon YouTube videos, or people that they disparage or feel are bad influences on the UFO community, like Dean Johnson feels about Ray Stanford. Oh, I'm going to jump back. One final thing here. So I did get to do a bit more reading when I was on vacation recently. I'm still got a long way to go on volume 5 of Jacques Vallée's Forbidden Science journals. But as I was reading it, and this kind of goes back to the AARO and Grush whistleblowing type things. So this volume 5 is the journals of Jacques Vallée from 2000 to 2009. This is the height of the Bob Bigelow period of time, and right before, I believe, the creation of OSAP, and it's still during the NIDS 1.0 period, if you know what I mean. And on page 77, during a section from March 3rd of 2001, there's a bit here where Vallée says, I believe he was talking about being at, he's at Joe Firmage's house in Santa Cruz Mountains, along with Hal Puthoff, Eric Davis, Michael Lindemann, Larry Lemke, and Al Holt from NASA. And after a few paragraphs, he says, in the end, we didn't learn much. Hal did talk about his contact with a 4-star general who once located a unique research project preserving UFO hardware, but it was never clear what the evidence consisted of. 4 other sources were listed: a technology executive, a field researcher, an intelligence operative, and Larry Lemke's own father, who had an R clearance at Lawrence Livermore Lab. He was once asked to machine some metal samples allegedly recovered from a saucer crash. So that bit there about Hal and a 4-star general, and there's a citation number 44, Vice Admiral Thomas R. Wilson was born March 4th, 1946. He became the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency in 1999 and held his post until 2022. And I'm like, wait a minute, a 4-star general named Wilson, who Hal says he met? This is sounding like the Eric Davis Admiral Wilson case that got so much attention of late. That's peculiar. Jump ahead a few pages, page 88, 89, when I got to see Jacques in La Jolla, California in June of 2001 at the SSE Society for Scientific Exploration Conference, and where I first met, the only time I met in person, Skylar Alphagren, there with Greg Bishop. And lo and behold, Vallée talks about, Janine and I had a friendly dinner with John Peterson. He took us to La Valencia in downtown La Jolla, a magical site high above the surf. He told us about the 4-star general who reported visiting a UFO reverse engineering project conducted by about 150 people in 4 states, working for a contractor with no line item in any budget. This must be the same story Hal told me. Citation number 50. This quote-unquote secret project refers to the statements attributed to Admiral Wilson, later discussed in the famous memo by Dr. Eric Davis. See entry number 44. So my point is, just like the AARO report says, there's been these reports circling around by people deeply involved in the UFO scene who often become activists, advocates for disclosure because they just know because they've heard all these stories. But here, within 40 pages of Jacques Vallée's journals from the 2000s, are 2 different Admiral General Wilson insider disclosure stories. What does it all mean? I don't know. Okay, good enough. That's it, folks. I hope you had a good time tonight. We'll be back. There's lots more coming up soon. Really appreciate you tuning in, listening, and yeah, just so much great stuff coming up. And we'll see you on the flip side. Peace out.
Who could it possibly be? Was it, oh, I don't know. Satan?